Okay, well, we're almost ready to start, 1:20. So this is the last week of lectures that I'll be presenting. And after this, the class teams will be giving their respective presentations. And Carrie is posting a sign-up sheet. I know there was a couple of teams where I had communication from students who had other engagements and had to be out of town. So make sure that you get yourself signed up for presentation days when all of your team will be present, because we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute, not just to the writing of the report and the compilation of the PowerPoint presentation, but also to the oral presentation, because that's an important part of this overall assignment. Now, I want to say that Carrie and I are a bit concerned with some of the teams' submission for milestone 3. And there seems to be some confusion about what is required for a paper. And looking through these submissions, sometimes there's lots of information, but it's poorly organized. Other submissions seem to have, very, very spotty completion of what should be a well-organized report by this point. So are there any questions before I get started about what is expected for milestone 3? We've set up conferences so that individual teams can meet with us. But looking at some of the teams, I'm concerned that you're going to be losing points towards your final grade on this important assignment. So any questions before I start with today's lecture?
When is milestone 3 paper due? The paper.
It's due at the last week of classes before the finals week.
Okay, thank you.
So the sort of sequence is that you have to finish the PowerPoint presentation, get the slides organized, make the slides, and then turn them in. But you can turn in your slide set and you can turn in your final report in the last week before the finals week. And so we'll be grading everything at once. So, if you're still working on the structure of your paper, you have things to do, you still have time to do that. Although, really, the rough draft should have allowed you to get a lot of progress on that. Question?
Are the comments for the milestone 3, like for the paper, out yet?
I believe so. Carrie, are they out?
Yeah, everything has been commented on.
So you'll see that some of the teams have got their work cut out for them to get to the level of paper that we're looking for this project. Okay. All right, well, let me begin the lecture. I've got quite a bit of material to cover in the next 2 days, and this is material that's very much pertinent to my own personal research and also the research that Carrie has done. And at the end of Thursday's lecture, Carrie will be presenting a shorter section on work that she's been doing on an oil spill off Louisiana, the Taylor Energy Platform oil spill. So that will be a look at some of her research and also sort of a broadening of this general topic of natural and unnatural oil in the Gulf of Mexico. And I make this distinction, unnatural and natural oil, to distinguish between the natural releases of oil, which occur as a normal geologic process and for which the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem has developed many adaptations and in fact supports lush deep sea communities of chemosynthetic animals and other fauna, and then accidental spills which result from various kinds of accidents and which can be very harmful ecologically for the Gulf's natural systems. So let's start by remembering what the carbon cycle is. So in the Gulf and in all marine settings, productivity takes place in the surface ocean, the photic zone, where the right combination of sunlight and nutrients supports primary production, and this primary production in turn feeds a complex ocean ecosystem. And most of the carbon continues to cycle in the surface ocean, but some of it sinks out to the bottom. And on the way down, there are many hungry mouths that wait to eat on food particles, and there's an active mid-ocean ecosystem. There's a deep scattering layer that migrates up and down. So there's a very complex food web that tends to keep the carbon in cycle throughout this very large volume of Earth's biosphere. But some of that carbon does sink out and end up in the marine sediments. And so if you look at the relative numbers here, we're talking about, and these are sort of numbers to give scale, essentially, the surface ocean has got a scale of about 1,000 units. And about 4 to 5 of those units sink to the bottom and end up in marine sediments. Now, over time, that carbon accumulates in marine sediments. And the carbon that accumulates in marine sediments, we have to distinguish, as we've done before, between 2 types of carbon. One is organic carbon, which can be utilized by organisms and bacteria. So the carbon can be eaten, as it were, or transformed into edible products by microbial activity. And that is contrasted with inorganic carbon, the best example of which, of course, would be calcium carbonate, which is a mineral form of carbon. Now that carbon is not available for biological consumption. And we identify these 2 forms of carbon as labile meaning that it's able to be eaten, and refractory, which means that it's sequestered. It can't be eaten directly. And so over time, this organic material accumulates in marine sediments, and some of that is transformed into the mineral product, our carbonate rocks. In fact, about 4 to 1 carbonate rocks are buried. And now we know what some of that carbonate is. The shell material from the skeletal remains of marine organisms comprises these carbonate rocks. But there is organic carbon, which is preserved during burial and remains present in the sediments of the deep sea. And of course, those sediments accumulate over geologic time and get deeper and deeper. And so there's an ongoing process of burial of organic carbon in marine sediments. And that organic carbon ultimately derives primarily from the biomass produced by surface primary productivity in the surface. So algal cells, the cells of phytoplankton, sink to the bottom and are preserved as organic material and carbonates. And we can get some sort of relative, idea of the the different conversions here. So here's the total mass of phytoplanktons. Some of this disintegrates into mineral compounds. Some of it reaches the seabed. It's dissolved or combusted in the seabed, and then preserved in the sediment in shelf areas and ocean areas is about 0.04% of the total primary production that occurs. But if you do this year on, year out, that results in a large amount of carbon. And at some periods during Earth history, the rates of productivity and the rates of burial in the surface in seafloor sediments have been much higher than they are today. So those periods of Earth history, when there was large amounts of carbon burial, are what supplies the carbon that becomes eventually what we call fossil fuels, oil and gas. So let's look at oil and gas reservoirs. When we talk about a reservoir, we're talking about a body of a volume of oil or gas which is entrapped in the geologic layers and can ultimately be drilled into and exploited by offshore oil production. So an oil and a gas reservoir can be considered as an amalgamation of three rocks. And I put rocks in quote because it helps you to think about what these three rocks combine to make a reservoir. So probably the most important rock is the preserved organic material, and we call this material kerogen. And this is a slate-like black rock substance which can contain high volumes of organic material, which has been lithified, solidified into rock. But some of the kerogen, you can actually pull it out and light a match to it, and it'll slowly burn. So the source rock is a carbon-rich slate-like rock called kerogen. And then there are reservoir rocks. Well, reservoir rocks are a type of organic layer which has a lot of porosity, a lot of empty spaces. And these empty spaces are what get filled with oil through the process of migration, which I'll describe here in a little bit more. So all these, and then the final rock is something called a cap rock. And this is a seal, so that the reservoir rock is permeable and has lots of porosity, and that those porous spaces can fill up with oil and gas. And as oil migrates out of from the deeper layers. And yeah, so. And then the final rock is a cap rock. And this cap rock material is a seal which covers up the reservoir rock and stops and prevents the oil and gas from escaping from this reservoir. It essentially locks it in place and puts it in a position where it can be drilled into and exploited. So all these features have to be present in contemporary geologic time. And the combination of these features make reservoirs of oil and gas. And some of these reservoirs are what would be called economic reservoirs. So there's sufficient accumulation of oil and gas so that oil companies or other interested parties can drill in and extract oil at a cost-effective basis for sale and profit. And so all these features have to be present along with processes like migration and so forth to allow this to happen. And an oil play is a conceptual model of how these reservoirs form. And so there has to be an ocean basin. There has to have been in the geologic past high rates of productivity. That organic material has to have been preserved at high rates in the sediments and then buried down to depths where pressure and temperature can transform the carbon into liquid and gaseous hydrocarbons. And so a lot of what oil company geologists do is to analyze different marine basins around the world and try to judge, based on geologic history and their understanding of the past, where economic reservoirs might be found, so that they say, okay, well, this is a prospective area for oil and gas. And we'll see that the Gulf of Mexico is, in fact, a very rich area where oil and gas can potentially be formed. So this kerogen, this source rock, is a mixture of organic chemical compounds that make up a portion of the organic matter. And so this, this is the kerogen, the slate-like material that I was talking about. And if you took a blowtorch to this, you would probably melt, and you might get a bubbling flame over time. The soluble portion is called bitumen. It's also called tars. And when you take this material and heat it to the right temperatures in Earth's crust, the kerogen releases, it transforms, and it releases crude oil or natural gas. And this combination of crude oil and natural gas are called hydrocarbons. And kerogens are present in high concentrations, are called source rocks. So source rocks are geologic formations that contain large amounts of this kerogen, and the transformation of the kerogen under heat and pressure allows the oil and gas to be released from the slate. And then when it's released, it's less dense than the surrounding material. So the oil and the gas that's released from the rock under pressure and temperature is less dense than the material in which it's released. Being less dense, it tries to migrate up through the sedimentary layers and come towards the surface of the ocean bottom. And so this process, is what fills the reservoirs. Okay? And so we talk about petroleum. Petroleum consists of thousands of different hydrogen compounds. The simplest hydrocarbon compound is methane. We've talked a lot about methane. So that's a combination of one carbon atom and 4 hydrogen atoms. And there's also, you can go, and those are straight chained compounds, methane, butane, pentane, so forth. These are straight chain compounds, and then the compounds can form rings and other hydrocarbon compounds. So it's a very complex family of compounds. And then there are also contaminants that are present, particularly sulfur compounds. And so this is sort of gives you a kind of an idea. Paraffins, these are wax-like materials, aromatics, asphalts, like cycloalkanes. These are alkanes. These are ringed compounds. Petroleum hydrocarbons contain a very complex mixture of many different forms of molecules, but collectively we refer to these as hydrocarbons. And a reservoir rock is a rock that acts like a sponge and can fill with hydrocarbons and can be drained for production. The porosity is the void space within the rock volume. So if you think of a piece of limestone, if you slice through it, you'd see little bubbles in places where there's spaces in the rock. And different types of geologic formations produce these reservoir porosity, highly porous reservoir rocks. One example of a geologic formation that would produce reservoir rocks would be the delta, gravel and sand-rich deltas. You think about a gravelly delta preserved, and the spaces between the individual gravel stones would contribute to porosity. Another kind of formation that makes a very effective reservoir rock are coral reefs. And everybody's seen corals, and you can think of the sort of fragile limestone that comprises corals. And so the dead corals, or the skeletal remains of corals, are potentially a highly porous substrate. And so, you know, the permeability of these layers is what allows them to fill over time with hydrocarbons that are migrating from greater depth in the sediment column. Okay. And the reservoir fluid is a mixture of oil and gas and water. The phases are not always distinct. You know, sometimes under very high pressures and temperatures, they form, you know, sort of critical, supercritical fluid mixtures where oil and the gas and they're all sort of mixed together in a what's called a supercritical fluid, a material that's sort of like a fully condensed steam. The oil dissolves in the gas, so there's a gas to oil ratio in typical reservoirs. And because many of the hydrocarbon compounds are soluble in water, for example, aromatics are somewhat soluble in water, the seawater or the produced water which is present in these reservoirs can also contain hydrocarbons. And so, you know, here's a mixture of the gases from oil, so nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and then methane, butane, propane, through pentane, and some of the straight alkanes that are present. Also oxygen and other gases. So that's just a look at what the reservoir fluid comprises. Okay, so I painted this picture. I said we preserve you know, carbon in the distant past, and by the distant past, I mean, you know, a lot of the source rock in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, is Jurassic in age, or Cretaceous in age. So we're talking about 120, 180 million-year-old carbon that's preserved in deeply, deeply buried sedimentary layers in the Gulf. So we painted this picture of this material being preserved, the organic material transforming under the temperature and pressure of deep burial, the hydrocarbons being released from the kerogen and then migrating upward and accumulating in traps, reservoir traps. And so here's a picture of some of this idea here. So the reservoir rock, if there were no seal over the top of it, the oil and gas would continue to migrate out and might escape into the ocean. And we'll see that in fact does happen fairly often. And so there are different geologic processes that can form these traps. So there's an impermeable layer over a porous permeable layer, and that porous permeable layer fills up with oil and gas, and then the cap rock traps it in its position. And so that's what the oil company explorationists are looking for when they explore for oil and gas. And so these can form anticlines, faults can form these. There are different stratigraphic traps, but I'll draw your attention in particular to anticlines because these are one of the more common types of traps. And when people began seriously to explore for oil and gas at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, domes were one of the things. Anticline domes were one of the geologic features that they learned to look for. And there's a very famous example of a dome structure in the Gulf of Mexico, in Texas, near the Texas-Louisiana border. And this feature was called Spindletop. And so this was a dome. One day they decided that they would drill for oil and gas. They had been drilling for oil and gas in Pennsylvania, and they decided to try in Texas. And so they drilled into this dome called Spindletop, where there had been indications that oil and gas was present, the natural seeps, sulfur, polluted water that indicated that there might be oil and gas present. And they drilled in, you know, and there was an explosion of oil and gas, and this was the sort of classic Texas gusher that you think about. And so that was the beginning of the oil boom in Texas. And I believe that was 1905 that they first drilled into Spindletop. And that was an example of one of these anticline features. Okay, so that's a brief overview of oil geology. And if any of you are geology majors, you'll appreciate that I'm summarizing quite a bit here to give a big picture view of what oil and gas is. But the real take-home messages are that, you know, that there's this excess primary production. Oil and gas are produced from the preserved algal cells. And that distinguishes it from coal. You know, coal is another form of hydrocarbon, but coal is made from larger plants, trees and shrubs and bushes that are often preserved in swamps and marshland. And so that type of hydrocarbon and that type of fossil fuel contains a lot more contaminants, just because trees and bushes and leaves have a lot more complex compounds than simple algal cells. So oil, as we know it, is very much a aquatic and specifically marine product, a result of productivity in the ocean. And that's an important point to sort of keep in mind when we think about where we can expect to find oil and gas and sort of how it relates to the overall process of ocean ecology. I'll draw your attention also to this salt dome here, and I'm going to be talking more about salt domes in a second because these are a particular feature of the Gulf Coast environment, and indeed the anticline that they drilled into at Spindletop was a result of a salt dome. So we'll explain salt domes also, but salt domes can form these oil and gas salt diapirs. Okay, so here's a picture of the Gulf of Mexico, and it identifies different features here, different regions. And so these are areas where, and these describe very different kinds of geologic history. And so if we sort of draw a line down roughly through the middle of Alabama, and divide the Gulf into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and then the central Gulf of Mexico, and then the western Gulf of Mexico. You know, just at a glance, we can see that there are sort of different provinces and different processes involved in generating this basin. Okay? So roughly speaking, the central portion here has been affected by drainage down, the present day drainage is through the Mississippi River. But the Mississippi River has, over the last several hundred million years, migrated back and forth. So there's sort of been a steady supply of sediments eroding from the Rocky Mountains and elsewhere and flowing down the Mississippi River and ending up in the Gulf of Mexico. So a huge supply of sediment over time. And with the result that the central and western Gulf of Mexico have huge accumulations of sediments. By huge, I mean kilometers, many kilometers of sediment have accumulated in the last roughly 200 to 150 to 200 million years. The eastern Gulf of Mexico has a relatively different history. So we can sort of look at this sort of late Jurassic period, early Jurassic. There was the tectonic activity was very prevalent. There was rifting. So this is when Pangaea starts to break apart. In early Jurassic, there was a rifting between North America and Africa and Southern Europe, which we've talked about in our process of plate tectonics. And so, as they separated, as the Atlantic opened up, there was what became eventually the Gulf of Mexico, alternately was, little pockets here were alternately exposed to seawater and then closed off. And so not until the late Eocene, approximately 15 million years ago, does all this close up and we get the present day formation of North and South America, the Isthmus of Central America, and this barrier between the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west. And so after this period, the Gulf is no longer, there's tectonic activity in the early to mid-Jurassic. This declines in the Cretaceous, and by the late Eocene, the Gulf has become a largely passive body, just like the geologically passive eastern coast of the United States. Right? The Florida Peninsula, this sort of shares a common history with the Yucatan, the southern portion, the western portion of eastern portion of Mexico, and both of these are limestone platforms that sort of detached, and there were seaways that opened up between what's now Georgia and what's now Florida, so water escaped here and out. But the important process to remember is that that there were these shallow seas. These shallow seas were highly productive. It's warm region, lots of nutrients from the flow of sediments coming down the Mississippi River, high levels of productivity, sediments burying this organic material, and also that the Gulf of Mexico opened and closed so that the Gulf was sometimes exposed and flooded with seawater, and other times, other portions of it were closed off and the seawater evaporated away. Well, turns out to be a really important geologic process in the Gulf, because that allowed the formation of what are called evaporites. And evaporites, we can think of evaporites as just sea salt. We know that if we evaporated all the water out of a body of a volume of seawater, what would be left behind would be about 3.4% solid material, right? And that would be mostly salts. Well, this process, because it was undergone over probably 50 to 100 million years, resulted in a massive accumulation of evaporites. And so what the Gulf features is layers of evaporites, layers of salt that are then overlain with even thicker layers of sediment. So in some places, these layers of evaporites, salt, are kilometer to even 2 kilometers thick in some places. So this is huge evaporite deposit, which results from this history of opening and closing of the basin that became the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see a similar process today. This is the Caspian Sea, and the Caspian Sea, has a little gulf here called the Karav Gol, Karav-Bogaz Gol, Gol meaning Gulf. And so this is a little portion of the eastern Caspian Sea, which was open to the larger Caspian Sea and then closed off after 1985. It was sort of blocked off, and all of the water that was in this very shallow Gulf evaporated away and left behind a deposit of salt. And so this is a sort of contemporary example of this evaporite formation process, which was so important for the Gulf. Well, why was it important? Well, we know that salt is a crystal, and crystals have the feature of being incompressible. So a crystal is a perfectly organized lattice of molecules, calcium, sodium chloride molecules that can't be compressed. So crystals can't be compressed and still be crystals. But sediments, which accumulate on top of the salt, are compressible, right? That makes sense. So you can compact mud, you can compact it more and more, and eventually it stops being fluid or deformable and lithifies into a solid mass, and then it compacts even more. Well, as the layers of sediment accumulate, remember that I was telling you that there were kilometers of sediment that accumulated in the Gulf of Mexico. So when there's about sediment accumulation of about 1,500 meters, the weight of that sediment pressing down on the lower portion of the column makes a rock which is denser than the halite crystals, okay? And it's sort of hard to conceive of, but that's the geologic process that takes place. So the compression of sediments consolidates it into lithified rock, rigid rock, but that rock has a greater density than the underlying halite crystals, which are incompressible. So what happens if you have a less dense material underlying a more dense material? What happens, and we've already talked about this, and we looked at the structure of the water column. What happens is that the denser material tries to push past the less dense material, right? That's the process. The dense doesn't float. It gets displaced upward by the denser material. And so that is what's happening across wide sections of the Gulf in a process which is called diapirism, or salt doming. And so you can imagine here that there's this accumulation, the sediments are pressing down, and the salt is being displaced upward. So you can think of it as if you were in barefoot and walking on a muddy creek bottom, your foot being denser than the mud would press down, and the mud would squeeze up between your toes. Probably most of you have had that experience. Well, it's not a perfect analogy, but that's close enough to what's happening. So the salt gets squeezed upward into these domes. And these domes can either be connected to the underlying salt layers, or they can be free floating. Allochthonous salt is a salt which is connected to the main body, and autochthonous salt are salt units that break free and sort of drift around. And so sort of drawing pictures and describing processes that take millions of years to really undergo, but that's in a nutshell what's happening. So the Gulf is full of these kinds of salt basins. So interestingly, this salt unit extends pretty far northward of what the present day coastline is. So here's the present day coastline is here. This is quite a simplified drawing. It's much more complex than this, but it gives a sort of picture here. So here's the accumulation of sediments, and as they accumulate, they're pushing the salt upward, and these salt domes, push upward, and in the outer deeper water of the Gulf of Mexico, they actually approach close to the sea floor. Okay, so this is a transect, and then this is the profile that we see through that transect. Okay. Well, what is the big picture resulting from this? So here is a picture of the bathymetry of the Gulf of Mexico. I think I probably showed this picture early on. And what this illustrates are two very different provinces in the present day Gulf of Mexico. There's one province which is described by the Florida platform and the Yucatan Peninsula, and both of these bodies don't have salt tectonics. Instead, you see a sort of a regular array of depth contours, which extend outwards and then drop off very steeply. And that's similar here in Florida and in the Yucatan Peninsula. So this is the Florida platform, and then this very steep drop-off is the Florida escarpment. This is one of the steepest escarpments in the world ocean, occurs off the coast of Florida, and then there's another one off the coast of Yucatan, where you go from about 500 meters down to about 3,000 meters over the space of a few tens of kilometers. So a very, very steep cliff, even by ocean standards. The other thing that's interesting about this is that there's a sort of a sill at about 1,500 meters that separate the Caribbean from the interior of the Gulf. So all the water that arrives in the Gulf of Mexico has to flow over that sill. And the process of flowing over that sill means that the water which fills the Gulf of Mexico is sort of the intermediate water. It's actually called Antarctic intermediate water. We've talked about thermohaline circulation and the different layers in the ocean. Well, the architecture and the structure of the Gulf means that most of the water comes from this intermediate layer. And so, although the Gulf is quite deep, the center of the Gulf is about 3,700 meters deep, the water that fills it comes from this intermediate Antarctic water. And so it has a minimum temperature of about 4 degrees, Whereas if you were at 3,500 meters in the Atlantic, the temperature would be about 2 degrees. So there's a, an immediate consequence here. That's physical oceanography. But let's focus on the bathymetry. So we have this, this passive margin here, regular contours, and then you transition into this sediment accumulation and the effect of all the salt domes. So here's the regular contours on the Gulf of Mexico, the Florida platform, and you can see that they extend pretty far out. During glacial times, the coastline would have been several hundred, several tens of kilometers further out in the Gulf than it is today. But then, then that drops off into very deep water here. Central Gulf is very different. And here you see a whole series of domes and basins and ridges, and all this structure as a result of two processes. One is the vast accumulation of sediments, and that's this huge layer here, which is a nappe, what geologists call a nappe of sediments. And this nappe has a name, the Sigsbee nappe. And then you see all these domes and basins and ridge lines, which are the result of the salt tectonic, the salt doming, diapirism, coming up and deforming those sediments and creating these domes. Sometimes the domes merge together and create basins. Sometimes there are long ridges that form. And so here we see the sort of the bathymetric evidence of this geologic process of sediment accumulation and then salt diapirism causing salt domes and salt basins. Well, this combination turns out to be very productive of oil and gas. So here's another picture of the northern Gulf of Mexico. I'm sort of focusing in here, and I'm focusing in on this central portion here, offshore Louisiana and Texas, and then the western portion of the Gulf. And you can see in more detail these basins, these ridges, and these domes. And then what I'm also showing you here are places where at different times we have confirmed that there are natural seeps occurring in the Gulf. And so these natural seeps are places where there's a flow of oil and gas that has broken through one of these capping structures and is bubbling naturally up out of the reservoir and escaping into the water column. Oops. Here's another picture of that same idea of this. So here you can see the basins a little bit more clearly, and then the domes and some of these ridge lines. And so this is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, has compiled this incredible map. We have this data set, and so this map resolves the depth of the Gulf of Mexico to a vertical resolution of about 25 centimeters and a horizontal resolution of about 4 meters. So this is one of the largest, most comprehensive bathymetric charts in existence. So you can see salt domes here, and there's salt doming all the way up to roughly the Louisiana-Florida border, and then you transition into this more passive margin. You can also see that there are canyons where flow and mud flows and turbidity flows have cut canyons into the sediments. So there's this is this complex geologic area. Well, okay, so this combination of results has created places where there are oil and gas escaping naturally. We should be able to play this. Well, I guess my movie isn't going to play, so surprising. Not to worry too much about it, but here, if this was playing, you'd see bubbles bubbling up on here. This is oil. These are gas bubbles. And this whole structure here is a lump of gas hydrate. So gas hydrate is this ice-like compound which forms when you combine gas and seawater at low temperatures, but greater temperature than freezing. And high pressures, you can form this ice-like substance. And then these little worms here They're each about an inch long, inch and a half, the biggest ones, and they make a living by browsing bacteria off the surface of this gas hydrate. And the dark, sort of dirty yellow color here is a result of oil trapped and suspended inside these gas hydrate bubbles. Well, the oil, bubbles out of these formations and rises to the surface of the ocean, and it forms these little drops. And so here, this is a picture. This is just a little bit bigger than a dinner plate. And then here is a single drop of oil, which has bubbled up from water depth. The water depth here, this site is about 1,000 meters. So one of these little drops of oil has traveled all the way up through the water and reached the surface. And when it reaches the surface, the oil is not mixing with the water, but it's denser. It's less dense than the water, so it floats on the surface. And because it's a liquid, it spreads out. And this is a process that was first described by Benjamin Franklin, who said that if you put a drop of oil in a beaker of water, that it would spread out and become, it would just keep spreading forever until there wasn't enough cohesion to hold the oil molecules together. And you can actually deduce what's going on here, because you see this sort of rainbow color. Well, this is light refracting through the layer of oil, but then as the layer of oil spreads, it gets thinner and thinner, and eventually it's so thin that it doesn't have color anymore. It's less than about 0.4 microns in thickness, and so it's thinner than the thinnest wavelength of visible light, which you might recall is about 0.3 microns. And so it disappears, but the oil is still there. The layer of oil is still present, and what the layer of oil does is it sort of dampens out the little wind ripples, the capillary waves that we've talked about previously, and sort of makes the water have this sort of slick, shiny appearance. Well, this turns out to be significant because this process of oil drops coming to the surface, spreading out, and then forming these continuous layers that suppress the capillary waves and make the surface of the ocean a better specular mirror, create what we call oil slicks. And these oil slicks are actually, as we'll see, visible from space. You can see these layers, okay? But we're not going to go to space for just a minute. We're going to have a little look at what we would see if we were on the bottom. So unfortunately, these are two submarines that were widely used for exploring the Gulf of Mexico back when I was a graduate student and an early scientist. This is the Navy submarine NR-1. This is was a nuclear powered submarine, so there was a nuclear reactor back here. The whole thing is about 130 feet long, and most of the space was taken up by the nuclear reactor, which was a very heavy, massive thing, and then this long stern end of the submarine, which was necessary to balance the great weight of the reactor. And then there was a forward portion here where the crew could sleep. 4 bunks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 shifts of sailors. That means 8 people would sleep in these bunks, 8 men. Although eventually, one of my graduate students was the first woman to go on board the NR-1, and actually one of the first women to go offshore on a nuclear submarine. I'm not sure what they do these days, but back in the 90s, that was quite a breakthrough that they allowed a woman on board the NR-1. They also allowed scientists on board. Scientists would sleep in a little rack, a little cot that was sort of hung from the ceiling right about here, and this was the mess hall. So there was a table where 2 or 3 people could sit at a time. And the ship was steered from here. There was different controls and everything. And then the most wonderful part was that you could go down in a little passageway, a little compartment underneath the floor here, and there were 3 portholes. And you could put your face against the porthole and look out, and the submarine would adjust its buoyancy, and it would drive along about 10 or 12 feet off the bottom. And so you could look down at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico The depth, the maximum depth was about 3,000 feet. I guess actually it would go deeper, but that was a classified depth. And so you could sit, lie here in this narrow little smelly compartment and put your head against the porthole and look down like you were looking to the bottom of a swimming pool as the submarine drove across the bottom. And I've spent many hours doing that. Altogether, I spent about 6 weeks in the NR1 in a variety of different expeditions. So that was wonderful. We were able to explore huge areas in a way and see things that literally no person had ever seen before. So this was the NR1 that was used, and then this was another submarine. This was the Johnson Sea Link, which used to be operated out of the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute in Fort Pierce, Florida. So the Johnson & Johnson fortune was for a time partially dedicated to ocean exploration, and they built this this submarine. And actually there were 2 submarines, the Johnson Sea Links, and they were wonderful submarines. They were very different from the NR1 in that they were powered by batteries. There were 2 compartments. The scientist and the pilot could be in this forward sphere here. This was an acrylic sphere about 6 feet in diameter. So the 2 forward passengers or forward scientists could sit inside this, and went down in this little device, and it was like being in a helicopter and looking around and seeing the sea floor. And but because it was battery powered, you really had a maximum time of about 3 hours, and then you had to come back to the surface. And so we would go down to the bottom, and then we would do various operations with the manipulator arm here. This was a bio box, and so this was a box of cold water. We could open this up, and we could put specimens in the box, and then close it up, and then bring the animals back to the surface. And keeping them cold was what actually helped to keep them alive. And so we could collect living specimens here. Here's a camera looking out. And then this is a cluster of tube worms, taxonomically similar to the tube worms that we talked about from hydrothermal vents, but was supported by a very different sort of process. Right? And so here's a look at one of these seeps here. This is a mound of gas hydrate. Here are streams of oil and gas bubbles escaping, and this is surrounded by a cluster of tube worms. And you can also see shells because there is a special species of mussels that lives in this setting. So how does this system work? Well, we've already talked about oil and gas reservoirs. So the oil and gas reservoirs are down several thousand meters below the mud line. And then a lot of times what happens is that the salt dome process, the salt diapurism, fractures the sedimentary rocks that have accumulated in shallower sub-bottom depths. And that creates, these faults create migration pathways, and the oil and gas can naturally escape from the reservoirs where it's been trapped and migrate upward towards the sea floor. And so that's what's being depicted here. And here you see an oil platform, tension leg oil platform. And this is a picture that was published in Natural Geographic back in 1996, I believe. And this platform, the Conoco tension leg platform, was at the time the deepest platform that was set in water depths of about 500 meters. And so nearby, there was a natural seep here, and the oil and gas bubbles up. At some point, the sediments are no longer consolidated. They get to be liquid mud or loose mud again, and then the oil and gas can sort of perfuse and diffuse through that mud layer and escape. When the gas comes in contact with water, because further down there's not much water, but then as you get closer and closer to the sea floor, the mud is permeable, and so water is able to penetrate in. And when there's sufficient water present, it combines with the gas to form gas hydrate. And this whole sort of soupy mixture of oil and gas and other material is a prime substrate for bacterial production. So bacteria grow rapidly and abundantly in this setting. Well, what do bacteria need to break down oil and gas heterotrophically? They need oxygen. Well, pretty quickly, the oxygen from seawater is exhausted. And we've already talked about this process when we talked about dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, that, when you accumulate, if you put, lots of organic material, but don't supply enough oxygen, the microbes will start reducing seawater sulfate to get the oxygen that they need to heterotrophically consume the oil. So that's what happens here. And so there's an accumulation of H2S, hydrogen sulfide, in these oily, gooey, bacteria-rich sediments. Well, hydrogen sulfide should maybe ring a bell, because if you recall, sulfide was a component of hydrothermal vent fluids, and the sulfide was what the symbionts of hydrothermal vent tube worms used for their chemosynthetic processes. And so the tube worms rely on the same sort of sulfide oxidation and the same bacterial symbionts as hydrothermal vent tube worms do. But in hydrothermal vent tube worms, the sulfides are being absorbed through the plume. Remember those big red plumes that I've showed you pictures of that are flickering extended into the hydrothermal fluid, or to alternately absorbing oxygen and sulfide from those fluids. Well, in the case of the Gulf of Mexico tube worms, there's a separation, and all the sulfide is present in the sediments, and all the oxygen comes from the overlying seawater. Right? So the seawater on the bottom is still plenty oxygenated. It's freely mixing with other waters, so it doesn't get oxygen depleted, but the sediment immediately below the mud line is reduced. And just like if you were in a marsh here and you stepped out in a marsh, there'd be a rotten egg smell from sulfide. Well, that sulfide is present because of the organic enrichment of the oil and gas that we see at these natural seeps. So here again is a picture of oil bubbling through, wicking through, and there are bubbles here, which you can't see too clearly. And these are drops of oil that are forcing their way through gas hydrate. A little bit more about gas hydrate. This ice-like substance traps individual molecules of methane and propane in little crystal-like lattices of water molecules. And there are different cavity types, different structures. You need to know all the different structure types. The simplest form of gas hydrate traps methane, and then there are more complex structures that can also trap propane and butane. But the basic idea is that these gas molecules, individual molecules of gas, are temporarily trapped within this lattice of water molecules, and that creates this rigid solid which contains high volumes of gas. So when we bring this gas hydrate to the surface, if we can keep it from melting in the water on the way up, we get to the deck, and then what you're looking at here are individual chunks of gas hydrate, these little white pieces here. And so what's happened is that we brought this to the surface, and actually what happens when you come up with a big sample of gas hydrates is all the different scientists rush out and they try to grab little pieces and preserve it in liquid nitrogen. And then when everything is done, everybody's got stuff done, they say, okay, well, let's have some fun. Let's light it on fire. And that's what's happened here. So this is the ice that burns. That's another way that they refer to gas hydrate. So here you see evidence that this process really does happen. If you bring these little snowballs up to the surface, you can light them on fire. And of course, what's happening is that these gas molecules are being released from their lattice of water molecules. And as they escape, they can combust into this burning process. And here's another picture of that, just to remind you of what's going on. Okay, so that's a look at the seafloor. I'll show you some more pictures of a dive with NR1, with a Sea-Link in a second here, but I wanted to describe an important part. So these bubbles of oil and gas start rising towards the surface, And as I showed you, when they get to the surface, they form each individual drop of oil or bubble of gas forms a little pancake, and those pancakes spread out into layers that cause the surface of the ocean to be smooth and slick, oil slicks. And those oil slicks reflect sunlight. This is called a sun glint pattern. So here you can see, here's a ship for scale. The ship is about 150 feet long. And so, you know, to give you a sense of scale, and here's where all of the oil and gas is coming to the surface. This is a sonar pulse, sub-bottom profiling, a water profiling picture. So this is column of bubbles, and you know, if you remember from the mid-ocean description of how geophysics works, the bubbles make good reflectors, and so the bubbles show up in the water column as this dark plume. So this is rising to the surface. Here the bubbles are coming to the surface in a particularly localized point, like right here, and then the currents are carrying them downstream. The wind and the currents are carrying them downstream. So this is a picture that's taken from an airplane at about 1,200 feet. And then here is the same process, not in this exact same seep area, but very close by, where we're taking a picture. And this picture is not taken from an airplane. This picture is taken from the space shuttle. I think actually the Space Shuttle Challenger took this picture. If you remember, the Space Shuttle Challenger was later destroyed, but earlier on it managed to take this picture. And here you can see these are the origins of these oil slicks. And then the oil spreads downstream, and all along you see these bright reflective patches of sun glint coming off the bottom. So I found this picture, this very self-same picture, back in 1991, 92, when I was a recent PhD, and I had an invitation to go to the Earth and Planetary Science Library at the University of Houston, which at that time had all of the film images from all of the different missions in space, including the Apollo missions and the Skylab and all the pictures from the space shuttle. And so I was looking through pictures of the Gulf of Mexico, you know, to sort of see what I would see essentially. And I started seeing these little streaky things. Well, I knew from previous work that these were probably oil slicks. And so back in 1991, 92, I had this realization that we could actually see oil, we could see the seep that was occurring. So down at the bottom of the ocean, in this place, there's one of these oil seeps that's going on. And I had the recognition that we could see these oil seeps from space. And so that we could actually map this process of oil seepage across the whole of the Gulf of Mexico using remote sensing satellite imaging. And so that idea became the basis of many years of research, which continues to this day. Carrie O'Reilly is busy thinking very hard about thousands and thousands of images of oil slicks, and probably more oil slicks. And she's probably quite sick of it by now, although it's starting to reveal, even now, some fascinating information. Okay, so this is just a reminder of how this process happens. Way down deep, there's a reservoir, there's a fault, the oil migrates through. At the seafloor, there's a ecological community supported by the oil. The bubbles escape, they rise to the surface, they form oil slicks that drift downstream, and we can image these oil slicks from airplanes or satellites. And here's a picture. This is not a picture, a photographic image. This is a picture made with radar. So this is, but the same process occurs here. We see these dark patches because they reflect radar energy differently than the seawater does. And so this is an overlay of several different images. These are surveys done by a company that was looking for oil in 1997, and then there were images from 2001, and then there was this picture which was taken in 2003. And what I want to point out is that we've already said that these are the origins of the oil slicks. Well, the oil slicks are originating here and they're drifting downstream. And so there are many things that make dark patches and oil slicks. There can be floating sargassum, there can be wind events that make the surface, like windrows that make it reflective. But if you're seeing the same oil slick origins, what we call oil slick origins or OSOs, in the same place multiple times, that's a pretty good indication that you're looking at something which is not an accident or a one-off, but results from an ongoing process of seepage. So this is the way that we can begin to make a map of all the images. So I'm going to come back to this notion in a second here, but before we leave the ocean environment, I wanted to just revisit what it's like to explore one of these settings in the submarine sea link. So here we are on the deck of the ship that launches the Sea Link, and you can see, you get a sense of the scale here. And so here are the two, this is a scientist, this is actually Mike Bardaro, who was my graduate student at the time, and then Phil, I can't remember, Phil Summers, Phil Sands was the pilot. And so the pilot would sit here and the scientists would sit here, and you can see they're a little bit cramped in, but generally speaking. And then there's this, they're inside this sphere, okay? And they picked the whole submarine up with this giant A-frame. Then there's a second chamber here. You can just see this porthole, and there are two other, well, there's another crewman in the back here, and then a second scientist can be in the back chamber. And they don't have as good a view, but they're able to collect water samples because there's actually valves that you can use to allow water to enter into the same. So the scientists in the back there would sometimes collect water samples that were helpful to us. Okay, so they've lifted the submarine off the deck, and then it gets lowered into the water. This is the ship Edwin Link, operated by the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution, Johnson Sea Link, and it's lowered in. And then here it is sitting on the sea floor. And this is a picture taken with a time-lapse camera that we deployed to monitor this lump of gas hydrate. And you can see that it's reaching out with its mechanical arm to collect some samples here. And here's the view of this same process from inside the sphere. And what we're doing here is we're collecting chunks of gas hydrate, and then we're putting them inside this pressure chamber to return them to the surface. So this was did a lot of work on gas hydrates back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. This is an example of those processes. And here's the camera that took that picture that you saw on the previous slide. Okay, well, here's one of these bushes of tube worms. You remember I said that the individual worms can be, 1.5 meters, 2 meters long in some cases, and an individual cluster, we call it a bush, just because that's an analogy to a plant bush, but really it's not. These are all animals, not plants. And then you can see the individual plumes, and so these are gill-like structures, and it's here that the tube worms are absorbing water. The gills are retractable, and what happens when you fly over this thing with the submarine is they sense the water movement and they retract their little plumes, and they sort of seal them off with this epiphthisome. This is sort of like a cork that they can pull back. And they also have to do this because there are lots of crabs, and these are squat lobsters. There's also shrimp, and these guys make a living by going up and pinching off little pieces of the tube worm filaments and eating them. And you remember that's the same thing I described from that hydrothermal vent setting where we saw tube worms that had all of their branchial filaments nibbled away by these predators. Okay, so here's a cluster of tube worms, a tube worm bush bottom, and then these are soft corals that are growing on the tube worm bush. Well, what's going on here? There's the presence of sulfide. Inside the tube worm is this trophosome, this big sphere packed with bacteria. And then the tube worm is absorbing oxygen from its plume. The oxygen is absorbed into the blood, and then the buried portions of the tumor absorbing sulfide. That's a big trick for that the tuberworms have a form of hemoglobin, just like hemoglobin in human blood. But this hemoglobin can alternately bind sulfide, which is a very toxic poison, and it can bind oxygen. So oxygen and can be bound and then reversibly released. And so, you know, the structure of the tubeworm hemoglobin is about 10 times greater diameter than the structure of a human or mammalian hemoglobin, and it has this amazing ability to bind sulfide. If you expose mammalian hemoglobin to sulfide, the hemoglobin molecule just sort of denatures and collapses, and that's why hydrogen sulfide is such a toxic gas, because as soon as it comes in contact with blood, hemoglobin in the blood denatures and stops functioning. And so many people have been killed by hydrogen sulfide poisoning. The other thing about hydrogen sulfide poisoning is that the first thing that it does when you're exposed to it is it kills off your olfactory sense so that you're no longer able to smell it. And so, you know, it can be very dangerous in that sense, you know, because you stop smelling it and it's still acting, and then all of a sudden it's over. So, you know, this is a remarkable example of evolutionary adaptation to these settings. Okay, well, that's the tube worms. And then there's another form of life that exists at hydrocarbon seeps, and that are these mussels. And so this is a mussel, and this is a mussel. It's also chemoautotrophic or chemosynthetic. It has bacterial symbionts living inside it, but it has a different physiology and a different evolutionary path. So these mussels are evolved from bathymodalis mussels, that just like the ones that you might see in the high tide area. We should spend a lot of time talking about mussels and how they were adapted to rocky shores, and they have these byssal threads that allow them to bind onto each other and bind onto the substrate. Well, that same process is happening in the, you know, here we are at about 600 meters down. These are the individual byssus threads that bind the thing together. Here is a lump of carbonate rock formed from the carbon in the gas. And then these mussels have inhalant and exhalant siphons, and they circulate this water, which is rich in methane, across their gills. So this is how this looks. So there's methane-rich water coming in and circulating. Well, in the gills, the mussels, seep mussels, which are called bathymodalis, these seep mussels have specialized cells which are filled with bacteria, and the bacteria are able to utilize this methane-rich water as a chemoautotrophic substrate, and so they grow. But in the case of tube worms, there's no digestive apparatus. All that has been lost in evolution, and by the time the tube worms are mature, they don't have any kind of gut system or digestive capabilities at all. But the mussels retain that, and so what they do is periodically they slough off this layer of bacteria-rich cells that they've been growing in their gills, and then they digest them in the regular digestive apparatus which they maintain. And so they're essentially, the mussels are essentially growing little colonies of bacteria in their gills, and then eating those bacteria using a conventional process. Okay? And so, you know, those are pictures here. And so there are other animals that live. This is a crab, a Rockinia, lithoidid crab, 3 walking legs, lithoidid crab, and they browse on material. There are also fish that occur at these sites. These are not chemoautotrophic fish. They're just regular fish, but they're attracted to the biomass and the structure that's formed by the hydrocarbon seep. Well, so that's one type of substrate. Okay, and now this is some of the bacteria. These are free living bacteria, not symbiotic bacteria, and they're forming on the surface. They're sort of using the sulfide. They're absorbing sulfide from the substrate below and oxygen from the water above. So these are chemoautotrophic bacteria, but they're free living as opposed to being trapped inside the symbiotic cells. And then here's another picture of gas hydrate with one of my favorite critters, these little worms we call ice worms. And you can see that once again, they're making a living by browsing bacteria off the surface. And they, in the process of doing so, they form little tunnels, and these tunnels can extend for centimeters back into the solid mass of gas hydrate. You can see one poking its snout out of the little tunnel here. And what these tunnels do, they probably have the effect of increasing the surface area of the gas hydrate. Gas hydrate is dissolving into the water. So these ice worms help to break down the gas hydrate over time. Okay, now we're going to return to the surface. So we're coming back to the surface and being picked up. Then a diver has to go into the water and grab this fixture here and insert it into a special socket on the top of the submarine. And then the submarine is lifted back up and being brought on board here. And you can see all of the collections that are present in the box here. And so as soon as the submarine is back on deck, then all the scientists and the graduate students rush out and collect their samples and take them back into the laboratory to process. So that's a sort of a typical dive in the Johnson Sea Lake. Okay. Well, I've been talking about hydrocarbon seeps, but there's another process which is generated by salt diabarism, and that's something called the mud volcano. And the mud volcano happens when a salt dome pressurizes a layer of gas-rich reservoir and causes the material to migrate forcibly out and create sort of eruptions of gas and oil on the seabed. Well, if you recall, this is salt, okay? So the water which is circulating around this salt is going to dissolve the salt. And when the initial activity, which causes, forms as an eruption of the mud volcano, stabilizes, what you have remains is a layer of very salty water, hypersaline water. So the salinity of the fluid in one of these mud volcano craters is about 120 parts per thousand, as opposed to 34 parts per thousand, 35 parts per thousand, which we would expect in regular seawater. So this is a much denser fluid than the water than seawater. And so under these conditions, you can get lakes of brine at the bottom of the ocean. And so here's a picture of a very tiny lake of brine and a very tiny mud volcano. So these two laser dots are about 10 centimeters apart. So this little thing is, smaller than a foot, like about that big around. And then there's a single bubble of gas that's escaping. And then this little river, this runoff, is the dense hypersaline fluid that's bubbling through here and running downhill. So that's a tiny example of a mud volcano. And here's a much bigger brine pooling habitat. This is a picture made with a device called a laser line scanner. And this brine pool is called Brine Pool NR1. And why is it called Brine Pool NR1? Because we discovered it with the NR1 submarine. And so it's not very big, really. It's about 15 meters across. This whole picture here is about 30 meters side to side. So it's not a giant feature. There are bigger ones, and subsequently bigger ones have been found, some of them that are about 100 meters across. And this dark material here is the lake-like, this hypersaline fluid, which is forming this sort of lake at the sea floor. And then this rim of material here, these are mussels. These are the same mussels that we saw at the gas hydrate deposit at other sites. But here, they're supported not by bubbles that are coming out with gas hydrate, but the highly concentrated gas in this brine, in this hypersaline layer. So the mussels, as long as they can keep their siphons out of the brine, can get an abundant supply of methane. And then here you see a little eel here, which is floating on the surface. And sometimes the mussels slip out of position and they sink down in the brine, which is fatal. And so the bottom of one of these brine pools is lined with, hundreds of the dead bodies of mussels, and even fish sometimes are trapped in this hypersaline brine. Okay. And here's an example of a chimerid. This is a type of deep sea fish, and this is at the edge of the brine pool here. So this fish is sitting, giving you a nice sort of portrait of part of the life associated with the brine pool. Other features that we might see are deep sea corals. This is a coral called Lophelia pertosa. Lophelia pertosa occurs all over the world in the deep ocean and depths of 1,000 meters or more. When they're plentiful at the Gulf of Mexico, they like the hydrocarbon generated limestone that we tend to find at seeps. And so that's an attachment substrate for them. And these colonies of Lophelia can be quite dense. And then just like coral reefs in shallower water, there is an associated fauna. Here's a sea urchin and a squat lobster present on this coral. And there are also pictures of, here's an anemone, called the Venus purse anemone, quite beautiful. And here's some other anemone, another species of anemone. And well, this is not a seep picture, but this is just by way of showing that anytime you have a hard substrate in the muddy bottom of the ocean, organisms tend to accumulate on it. So this is a ship, and the archaeologists tell us that this ship sank sometime in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So it would have been a sailing ship, and it's been sitting on the bottom, and corals have been growing on it ever since. And so, well, that's a picture of what the deep ocean of the Gulf of Mexico looks like as visited by these submarines, NR1 and Johnson Sea Link. Sadly, for me at least, both of these submarines have been decommissioned, not used any longer. And okay, well, it looks like I've run out of time. Just a reminder that the surface oil is a tracer for the natural seeps. And next Thursday, we'll be looking at how we've used this tracer as a way of tracking the total amount of oil that's discharged from these natural seeps, and also for using the same technology to investigate oil spills. So let me stop there. Are there any questions? Did you like this? Is this a good picture? Okay. All right. Well, I'll see you all on, I guess I've got a conference tomorrow. And until then, I will, there's a quiz over this material. And so we'll need to look at this. All right. Goodbye, everybody.